I'll read a scripture, Matthew 5, verses 14 through 16. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. What to say? What to say on a 4th of July weekend? What to say on a 4th of July weekend with our nation in the state it is in right now? You know, I don't know if you're like me, but it has not been a very pleasant experience for me to watch as the last few years, immorality after immorality has kind of danced through our land and taken over. And it's not just immorality. It's immorality that is in your face. We are changing America, and there's nothing you can do about it. How do you respond as a Christian to that? Well, I think a look back through some of our American history might be helpful at this point. In 1630, one of the first great American voyages took place to the American continent. It was led by John Winthrop. He was the first great American, and with his ability, he gathered 1,000 people and the ships to take them to the New World. He believed that they, like the ancient Israelites, were leaving Egypt and coming to a chosen land where they could make the world right. And so on board the ship as they came here, he preached this sermon. And he said, we must consider that we shall be a city on the hill, and the eyes of all people shall be upon us. He believed that here they could make a community that was right, and not only would it help us, but it would convert and save the old world as well. This idea of America as a city on a hill, that was one of America's cherished beliefs for a long time. Well, in the beginning, America was a pretty rough place. There were vast territories to explore, huge problems to overcome, and new governmental systems to create. And some of this creating wasn't very pretty. There was the displacement of the native people here. There was sickness and disease to overcome, and there was a war of independence to be fought. And then, of course, there was that huge struggle at the very core of our history for the very meaning of America. There was a West to be won, railroads to be built, cities to be made. Not only that, but there were 2 world wars that we had to fight, a Cold War that we had to endure, and a war against terrorism that lay ahead of us. But as the historian Paul Johnson says, part of the story of America is the story of a people who overcome their problems with intelligence and skill, faith and strength of purpose, courage and endurance. Andrew Bakovich notes that the United States stands preeminent among its peers and in its success. No nation, he says, has been more successful in building itself. And so, having outlasted, exhausted, or crushed its rivals, we stand preeminent in the world. And I'll tell you what, when I lived in Canada, it was a funny thing watching their news. It was kind of ho-hum, like watching about what happened in Granny's back pasture, because that nation simply was not involved in the world the way we are. Now, it is true It is true that for some people, America does not mean what it might have meant. Some people question its legitimacy. Some people say that after the sins of slavery and racism, of the oppression of the American people, or of the native people, or the mistreatment of women, we do not have the right to be called a great nation. But America seems to be a people who overcome their problems, who see their problems and overcome their problems. No nation in the world has been more successful in building ourselves and spreading our ideology to the rest of the world. You know, I read somewhere where in 1940 there was about 40 democracies. Today there are 160 democracies. If you were to judge things by their outcome, the great world revolution would be that of America's call to democracy. Not only that, but we have taken and turned thousands of square miles of mostly empty wilderness into today a teeming city of over 300 million people. We have taken land that was once considered worthless and unproductive and made it some of the most productive and expensive land in the world. We have freeways that crisscross the land, huge gleaming cities, tremendous wealth, and unrivaled power. Paul Johnson says, this is a human accomplishment without parallel. Well, what has been Christianity's part in all this? You know, some Protestant groups, Protestant mainline churches, along with them some secular kind of atheistic groups, would say that we actually live in a post-Christian time, a time after Christianity, and that Christianity is on the decline, and soon will just be one religion among others, or will simply disappear. And I heard this not too long ago on PBS. There were these two women that were the news anchors of that show at the time, and they kind of had this look of stage sorrow on their faces, and they looked like they were so sorrowful that Christianity was declining, they said. I have been hearing this story all of my life as a kind of wish dream by the liberal left who so want it to be true. They proclaim what is not true to be true simply because that's what they want. And so they hope that by proclaiming it, somehow it'll happen. And it's true that it has been a comforting story to those liberal Protestant denominations. For they have lost numbers, and I mean huge numbers. In the 1950s, 55% of all people in America that went to church was a member of a liberal Protestant church. Today, that number has dropped to something like 9%. I mean, they have lost tremendous people. And so this comforts them to hear that. But these doomsayers about Christianity, they have not taken into account the more conservative evangelical churches in America, of which we would be considered generally a part. They have seen us as kind of on the peripheral and not simply worthy to be counted. But when we are counted and looked at, the story is anything but doom and gloom. Two sociologists, Roger Fink and Rodney Stark, say that if we turn that story on its head, upside down, we will be more close to the truth. What they did was they ignored this myth that is handed on to us about the secularization and decline of Christianity in America. And they went back through American history and looked at the actual numbers of people attending church in each age. You know, in the beginning, back in colonial times, America was a rough place. And there were large numbers of single, unmarried young men who had come here, and they had anything but going to church on their minds. Not only that, America was a very immoral place back then. In New England, from 1761 to 1800, fully 1/3 of all the births that happened took place after less than 9 months of marriage. Not only that, but one early preacher, Henry Muhlenberg, said, you know what? You can't hardly get people to go to church back then. He said, it is a free and unbridled land. And really, it could be a vulgar place too. One young man, when asked about Christianity, pointed to a pile of manure and said, there is my God. People believed what they wanted and rejected authority. And sure enough, back then, the numbers show that back in early colonial times, only 17% of Americans regularly attended any church. But the churches, they didn't just sit there kind of wringing their hands. They got to work and had meetings and preached conversion. And what took place? We had the first great spiritual awakening here. In the early 1700s, this spiritual awakening happened that swept through the land, and great and powerful preachers rose up who preached this conversion. Not only that, but there was a funny phenomena that kind of went along with it. At that time, the American colonies were really separate from each other and didn't have much to do with each other. They had more to do with old Europe than they did with each other. But this great awakening, this preaching of evangelism, was the first kind of shared experience they had that seemed to transcend borders and overcome their differences and rise up national figures. In fact, John Whitfield was the first great American celebrity, this preacher. At times, 25,000 people would gather to hear this guy proclaim. And his voice was so clear and so powerful that at that time, even in a crowd that large, before microphones, everybody could hear him clearly. In fact, Benjamin Franklin once heard him, and the streets were crowded with thousands of people. And so Franklin decided to do this experiment. He began to back up slowly, block after block, seeing if he could still hear Whitfield. And sure enough, even at a great distance away, he could still hear him distinctly and clearly. At times, thousands of people would fall to the ground and cry out to God as Whitfield would thunder, "Are you saved?" and explain to them the reasons why they were not. In the early 1800s, we had another great spiritual awakening. This one was led by hardened frontier preachers who would travel for miles through kind of dangerous wilderness to reach these camp meetings and preach evangelism and conversion. And some of our own from the Churches of Christ were there, like Raccoon John Smith and Barton W. Stone. They preached in meeting after meeting and Bible study after Bible study. Schools were raised up that created evangelists who headed west with the frontier. What happened to this evangelism? It never stopped. It never, ever stopped. It continues up to this day. I don't know if you realize that. You turn on your radio, you can always find someone on some station somewhere saying something out of the Bible. Do you realize how extraordinary that is? When I lived in Toronto, that's a huge city. You turn on your radio, you'd be hard-pressed to find any radio station that had anything to do with Christianity. Not only that, but when Sunday mornings came, you know what the streets looked like in Toronto? Instead of having people going to church and church parking lots, having people there, of the few churches that were there, there was only a smattering of cars, and those streets were empty. Here, in our little portion of America around the Flathead Valley, I can think of 7 Christian radio stations that you can tune into. Not only that, but Sunday morning, take a drive around town. And church parking lots are always kind of full of people that are parking there and going to church. And in fact, the preaching of Christianity in America happens so much everywhere all the time that it is just an accepted a part of American life. And we don't even think about it. In the history of this country, churches that have been able to succeed are those churches who have been able to have a message that is heartfelt and that has grabbed the imagination of the ordinary person. Not only that, but they have been churches that have been able to pass their faith on to their children, so that faith is passed on from generation to generation. Well, what has been the result? In 1776, on the eve of the Revolutionary War, only 17% of Americans regularly attended church. On the eve of the Civil War, that number had risen to 37%. In 1902, that number had risen to 51%. In 1952, that number had risen to 59%. And that number continued to inch upward, so that in 1980, 62% of Americans regularly attended church. In fact, this number of church attendance increased in every decade of America's history, except those immediately following the Civil War. If Fink and Stark are right, and nobody has been able to challenge them, then what we have witnessed is not the continual secularization and decline of Christianity in our country. What we have witnessed is the continued Christianization of our land. What has been the Church of Christ's part in all this? In 1830, 2 groups got together, that of Barton W. Stone and Alexander Campbell, and they formed the Restoration Movement that sought to restore New Testament Christianity. How many of them were there at that point? Not many, a few thousand. But they went out there and they began to proclaim their faith in such a way that today, over 1 million people in this country alone regularly attend and worship at a Church of Christ. Why have we done so well? Because one of the ways that Christianity works in this country is that there's no official state church. That the government, it's supposed to stay out of that stuff. It's supposed to leave us free to pursue the most cherished part of our lives, our relationship with God, free and unhindered. And so you have no established church at the beginning. And every church has a free and equal chance to go out there and win converts. And what has this created? A huge open marketplace of religious ideas, where if you want a church, what do you have to do? You have to go out into that marketplace and win converts. I mean, if anywhere, the Great Commission of Jesus in Matthew 28:19, go and win disciples, holds true. It holds true here in our land. And this is just crucial for us to get how Christianity, how religion works here. This is crucial for us to understand. It is the rough and tumble world of evangelism. And if you want to win here, if you want to win, what do you have to do? You have to go out there and win converts and proclaim to them in such a way that they believe and understand the truth of your convictions. See those mainline churches that have lost so many people? They didn't do that. And what happened to them? They are reaping the consequences. But the churches of Christ, we are upstarts here. And because from the very beginning, we were always willing to go out there and enter the fray and talk to people about God and proclaim to them the Bible, we have had great success. All right, you say. That's a nice story. But the picture of Christianity in 2021, that's not so rosy. And I would concede that point, that it's not. I am reminded of the scripture in Judges chapter 2, verse 10, when it says, that generation went to be with their ancestors. And another generation grew up after them, who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. This generation did what was evil and worshiped the Baals. In fact, that generation departed from the Lord. It departed from the one who had done so much to bring them into that good land. Does that sound familiar? I mean, that's what it feels like to me today, that a segment of this generation has left God, who has done so much to bring us into this good and blessed land, and pursued other gods. And as we grow more perverse, what happens around the world? What happens in reaction to us? I heard not too long ago that the Kremlin in Russia tightened its ban on same-sex couples adopting children. I mean, that is just smart. Putin is leading a coalition against the West, not only on geopolitical grounds, but on moral grounds as well. Not only that, but he had an address claiming that he would protect family values. Do you know how some people in the world see us right now? They see us as a cultural aggressor. We promote abortion throughout the world, gay and other rights we try to foist on these other countries. I heard that when Ireland was voting on such issues, our government spent $28 million in advertisement to try to get them to vote their certain liberal way. Our more progressive people have declared war on traditional values, not just here, but throughout the world. How would you feel if you're another country? Would you like that? Is that going to win us friends? I doubt it. More than that, R.R. Reno says that on issue after issue after issue today, we are told that the future has spoken, that history has leveled its irrevocable decree, and woe to us who do not follow that decree. And in fact, I heard one guy gleefully say, what does the opposition do to all of the new and progressive things we're doing in culture today? It can do nothing. It's done. It's set. The future is set, and that's it. How old is America? 245 years, if you go by the Declaration of Independence. You know, the church has been around for 2,000 years. And it has often been around in nations and under rulers who made laws who are radically opposed to Christian truths. Reno says that this whole talk about the inevitability of history, about the inevitability of the future, this reminds him of Dietrich von Hildebrand, who lived in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Hildebrand recognized that the Nazis were they were a threat to civilization, and that Hitler was also a severely anti-Christian character. But what was the mood like in Germany at that time? This is the future. It is set. It will be that way no matter what. And so Hildebrand, he watches as Christians, people who call themselves Christians, capitulated, not only capitulated, but collaborated in what was going on there, because there was this fear that somehow people would be out of step with a power that seemed to have history on its side. And so these people, they would go along with it even if they didn't welcome it. How long did that history last that was supposed to be so inevitable? In 10, 12 years, that history was gone. And the only thing that was left was a sad residue of regret for those churches who had not witnessed clearly and powerfully in the dark days of 1930. So what do? One thing we can do is we can learn from the people of our own American history and what they did. Remember those shiftless young men who lived on the frontier? You know, back then there were also buckets and buckets of greed and unabashed land grabbing. And there was alcoholism like you can't believe, like a third more per person than there is today. And there was just general wildness. You know what people believed could improve the social conditions? They fasted and they prayed that God would rescue the land from what they called this Egyptian darkness. And then they sent their evangelists to these camp meetings believing that Christianity could improve conditions, could make the frontier better. And guess what? It worked. These hardened frontiersmen, they went away from these camp meetings changed. And these young men, they would listen to these sermons, and not only would they listen to these sermons, they'd meet Christian girls. And they'd get married. And the frontier was civilized. You know, not all the founders wanted a Christian nation. I said this a couple of weeks ago in class here. Some of the founders didn't like Christianity. And they wanted it to be gone. In fact, they planned for it to fade away and disappear in American life. But because Christians got to work when they needed to, just the opposite happened. Well, today, I think we are facing another kind of Egyptian darkness, aren't we? And while it can be said that America certainly is not a model of a city on a hill right now, or a Christian light to the world, there can be no doubt at all that we Christians in the midst of America, we are called to be that city on a hill and that light to the world. What time is it? It is time for us to fast and to pray. And it is time for us to get real about our Christianity in the midst of the nation so that we can do this world some good. What are we supposed to be? Verse 16 of Matthew 5. We're to be a light. Our Christianity is supposed to be a light to the world so people look at us and see our good deeds and give glory to God. We're to be a conduit to God, to live in such a way to where people begin to learn of Jesus Christ and understand him. You know, there's a belief out there that says that if we make our Christianity just a little more flexible, if we just give in to the moral beliefs of our time, we'll have more people come to church and we'll do better. But the evidence shows that that is not true. You just ask those mainline churches how that works out. Instead, clear and decisive understanding presented by us about what difference faith makes in a life, that is what is needed. When the church strengthens its backbone and resists all those calls to give in and make ourselves more like the world around us in order to remain relevant, when we do that, when we strengthen ourselves and won't go there, that is when we become most relevant. Because people don't go to church to find more of what they can find out there in the world. They go to church to find God. And that which attracts people to church, that which grabs their imagination, that which grabs their convictions and lures them, is the challenge to the soul. A challenge to reach up beyond themselves and become more than they are, in fact, more than they thought they could ever be. That's the lure. The lure of the call of Christ upon our lives, and that is what we're supposed to be about in these dark days. Not only that, but by living our faith with strength in the midst of American life, we do another thing as well. We show the rest of the people that America is not the greatest kingdom there ever was. That there is another kingdom whose mighty deeds and transforming power has a hegemony that far outreaches any kingdom that is tied to a specific spot and a specific place in time. And it is that of the kingdom of heaven, with Jesus Christ as its Lord. Amen. Well, that's our message. If you'd like to respond, responding on the 4th of July might be a good thing. So please come as we stand and sing.